So over the past few videos talking about payment processors and about censorship, what needs to be made clear is that the hand of mammon has grown long and subtle. That which once served the household now governs the house. Commerce, which was once the humble servant of the common good, now postures as arbiter of the moral order. Commerce now decides whom it shall feed and whom it shall starve, not on the basis of law, nor in submission to conscience or the public will, but in obedience to publicity campaigns, to ideological trends, and to the murmurs of unseen councils. Visa, MasterCard, PayPal, and the like, without legislative charter, now hold the power to silence speech, suppress livelihoods, and decide what may or may not be said and sold in the public square. This is abominable. It is homosexual. It is not the nature of these entities to act from moral principle. Their God is liability, their creed is optics, and their gospel is the maintenance of shareholder trust. Yet these powers do not act alone. The whip hand of economic exclusion is often directed by those who cry for moral clarity, those who, finding the legislative process slow and the cultural tide uncooperative, reach instead for the nearest lever that might still produce an effect. Sometimes these are prophets of progress, but not always. Recently, I watched The Secret War to Censor the Internet by the YouTuber Lextorius. Shout out to the YouTuber Kudere Kun for pointing this out to me. Lextorius made it clear that among the NGOs pushing for online censorship, Christian organizations, earnest in their zeal, firm in their doctrine, and upright in their moral clarity, have also employed these levers themselves.
Trafficking Hub was at the forefront of the movement to shut Pornhub down and is referenced alongside Micklethwait in Christoph's article, which also sneaks in the line, "We're already seeing that limiting Section 230 immunity leads to better self-policing," all before Christoph's call for credit card companies to cut ties, something that Exodus Cry and Morality in Media had been doing for years, having just written an open letter directed at Pornhub's payment processors a few months earlier. So after all this is where Serena Fleitas decided to sue MindGeek, Pornhub's parent company, for not taking proper measures to remove a video of her being abused while underage. As most lawsuits do, it throws the entire book at them, including charges of facilitating sex trafficking, which allowed them to bypass Section 230 protections. And it wrangled in every company affiliated with MindGeek in a massive RICO case, including Visa. Importantly, when Visa sent a motion to dismiss their involvement in the case, the judge denied it, citing the fact that Visa had previously cut and then restored ties with MindGeek since Christoph's article as primary evidence that they had conducted some internal investigation and must have been aware of any illegal activity, thus making them complicit. The allegations against MindGeek are obviously very serious. As Micklethwait posted on her Twitter, there are currently 27 lawsuits being made against them, most of them unresolved as far as I'm aware. Though the reason that I bring it up in this video is because this lawsuit is the single thing that has led to every other website I've talked about either shutting down or changing policy since 2020. It is the nexus point that you can trace all of the other payment processor-related problems back to. Companies like Visa and MasterCard and PayPal have long been a prime target for advocacy groups to put pressure on. Of course they would be. Their dominance in the financial market means they have complete control over which companies live and die based solely on who they want to do business with. And they have no real obligation to do business with anyone or justify why they won't.
One supposes their intentions are noble, their targets are vile, and their ends, to a point, may be praised, but their means, unfortunately, lie outside the bounds God has ordained for them. And this is why I, even as a Christian myself, would not abide by this behavior. For the Christian must never forget that the moral law which binds all men does not give license to usurp the instruments of another sphere.
You remember, at that time, we took a look at Maslow, and we took a look at Rogers in their statement about who man is. Basically, good and perfectible. That brought us to this issue, why is there evil in the world? Rogers says, experience leads me to believe that it is cultural influences which are the major factor in our evil behaviors. Maslow then said, sick people are made by a sick culture. Healthy people are made possible by a healthy culture. What did that lead us to in terms of a humanistic view of man? basically good and perfectible. Mental health can be attained by getting in touch with yourself, self-actualization. But it was the social institutions that were the problem. Social institutions are responsible for man's evil actions. And that is why we have the kind of social actions that we have today. Because as soon as the state begins to believe that it has the right and the obligation, if these are the problems, we will invest power in this institution to help gain control of those institutions which are causing the evil in society. And the state then begins to rise in power and begin to think that it does have the right to breach the sovereign boundaries of each of those spheres. Sphere sovereignty is gone, and we have the rise of the state. And when the state begins to rise in power, it no longer observes any kind of sphere sovereignty at all, but begins to assume that it has the right to absorb all of those institutions underneath its control and power. And that then brings us to a great conflict. What is the conflict? What is the problem? It ends up being an ethical problem.
The biblical point is not that our problem ultimately is an intellectual one. It's a moral one. That's why we appeal for relativism. Because if there is no objective truth, if there are no objective standards, then it's okay for me to live however I want to live, according to my preferences. But if there is a God, and He's normative, and He has a law, then He says no when I want to say yes, and I have a conflict. If I could just get rid of objective truth, get rid of objective reality, then I can live however I want to live.
If I can just get rid of objective truth, then I can live however I want to live. What is the conflict here? What is the problem? What do we need to get rid of? God. He becomes the problem. When the state begins to rise in power, his restrictions, his ethical notions now become the problem, and we need to remove him. Now, you know you can't remove him, but the state will begin to act as if he is no longer there. And when the state begins to act as if he is no longer there, then we begin to view the state in a little different way. Look at Hegel's comment about the state. The universal is to be found in the state. The state is the divine idea that exists on earth. We must therefore worship the state as the manifestation of the divine on earth, and consider that if it is difficult to comprehend nature, it is harder to grasp the essence of the state. The state is the march of God through the world. Now, I would submit to you that that is exactly what is going on. Now, we don't bow down to some statue, but we begin to act as if it is God. And we change the sphere of God and man now to state and man. That the state becomes that which we turn to answer all of our problems. The state begins to assume that it has the right over all education, begins to assume it has the responsibility for the poor. The state begins to assume that all ethics now are bound up in the state's declaration of what is right and wrong. It assumes it will take care of the needy, of course, using your goods to do it. It will determine what wages can be paid, and it will determine what marriage looks like, and on it goes. The state rising up and assuming authority and power destroys these institutions.
This is the doctrine of sphere sovereignty, something not conceived of by man, but revealed in the very structure of creation. and upheld by the Lord Christ, in whom all things cohere. And for anyone unaware of what sphere sovereignty is, let me break this down for you. Sphere sovereignty is a concept that was systematized and popularized by theologian Abraham Kuyper. The way it works is that society is composed of distinct spheres or realms, each with its own authority and responsibility. Now, these spheres operate independently from each other, and they have their own God-given sovereignty in their respective domain. And what that means is that no single sphere should dominate or control the others. Examples of these spheres include the family, the church, the state or government, the education system, businesses or the economy, and finally arts and culture. Now, each of these spheres has its own jurisdiction or area where it has authority and must be allowed to function freely. And this is important because it limits totalitarianism or overreach by any one sphere. In other words, the state shouldn't control the church or the family. Moreover, this structure protects freedom within each sphere. Each area can fulfill its role without interference or usurpation by others. This structure also recognizes the value of the roles people play in their lives and the relationship those roles establish, affirming that different areas of life have different kinds of authority and ways of functioning. And finally, the structure reflects a theological conviction that God ordains multiple authorities, so no human institution can claim absolute control. Kuyper believed that God is sovereign over every sphere, and that Christians should engage in all spheres of life, bringing their faith to bear in politics, in education, family life, the arts, etc., but without merging everything into one monolithic institution. Now, the state is just one sphere among many. Its role is to protect the rights and the freedoms of all spheres. Therefore, it is not given to the financier to wield the sword of the magistrate. It is not given to the merchant to excommunicate as a bishop would. And it is not given to the Christian reformer, however sincere, to bypass the form of law and appeal instead to the unseen tribunal of corporate discretion. For when we do this, we are calling upon the money changers to serve as judges of righteousness. And therefore we are inverting the order of the spheres and undermining the legitimacy of Christian engagement in the public realm. Unfortunately, we live under the shadow of post-Enlightenment assumptions, where the world is presumed to be secular by default, and Christianity is something to be grafted on, an optional overlay rather than the ground of all meaning. But as John Frame's normative perspective would remind us, this is precisely backward. The world is by nature God's world. It is Christian at its root, and all that deviates from that reality is not neutral, but a distortion of the created order. So what we are witnessing today is not the neutral functioning of secular institutions, but Christian-born structures turning against their own foundations. Institutions that were once rooted in godly purpose have now been repurposed as tools in power struggles. And what makes this especially grievous is the spectacle of Christian NGOs wielding economic pressure as if it were a moral instrument, claiming to act on behalf of righteousness while employing a means that is foreign to the kingdom of God. And what this means is that what is built today in the name of purity will tomorrow be turned against the saints. The mechanism of financial exclusion, once normalized, will be claimed by those who preach a very different gospel, and we as Christians will only have ourselves to blame, for we will have taught them how to do this. Judgment begins at the house of God, and it trickles its way outward into the world, not the other way around. Now let it be stated clearly, it is not wrong to call for the removal of evil, but it is wrong to do so by circumventing the instruments that God has appointed for such removal. Christians who are grieved by pornography must pursue law, governance, not corporate fiat. We must labor within the bounds of constitutional order and legislative process, not only because this is prudent, but because it is just. It's a sin against order to confuse the spheres. It is a form of rebellion to demand that the hand of commerce do what belongs to the robe of the judge or the pulpit of the preacher. Christ is Lord of all. He reigns not in chaos, but in structure, not in revolution, but in the reformation of every sphere in its place and purpose under his name. So let the church be the church, let the state be the state, and let commerce be commerce. Let each acknowledge its limits and responsibilities, and let the Christian never forget that in all his labors, whether as a citizen, a parent, an entrepreneur, or an advocate, he must work not only for the good, but through the good. That is the way of Christ. That is the true moral order, and that is the calling to which we must once again submit. So some of you have asked me, what is the solution? What is the path forward? Well, Abraham Kuyper reminded us that every sphere of life stands under the immediate sovereignty of Christ. The state is not the church, and a payment processor is not a magistrate, and a nonprofit is not a priest. Each sphere has its own tasks, its own limits, and its own dignity. Now, when any one sphere extends itself into another, be it a tech firm enforcing orthodoxy or a Christian group exercising economic leverage without legal authority, what does that do? Well, it deforms God's design and it invites tyranny under the guise of reform. So we need to reassert this structure. Christians need to recover the conviction that moral law does not justify lawless behavior. Our desire for a righteous society cannot come at the cost of procedural righteousness. If we abandon lawful means to enforce moral outcomes, we are not advancing Christ's kingdom. Instead, we are betraying it from within. So even Christian organizations, motivated by deeply held convictions, must not transgress their proper bounds. To do so is not to redeem the culture, but to compete for control over it.